Greetings. You are listening to or watching the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and a participant in the Christians for Liberty Network. My guest today is Connor Murnane. He is the Campus Advocacy Chief of Staff at FIRE. And I think you had a different title when we talked to you a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so we can talk about that as well. So FIRE, or the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, has a mission to defend and sustain the individual rights of all Americans to free speech and free thought, the most essential qualities of liberty. FIRE educates Americans about the importance of these inalienable rights, promotes a culture of respect for these rights, and provides the means to preserve them. And as I mentioned, we did do a brief interview at Freedom Fest with Connor 2 years ago, so thanks for talking with LCI again.
No, always a pleasure, Cody.
Well, so folks who may have heard of FIRE in the past might have known you under a different name. So FIRE changed this name but kept the acronym in 2022. So it was the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. And that was, I think that was at the time, that was something that everybody was really talking about, was are the college campuses becoming these places where you can't really talk. And then, of course, there's the right-wing talking points that it's woke and, its own kind of culture of, kind of almost like a pseudo-religious culture of progressivism. But the name change is now, you're now the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And so what did that change signify? And how has FIRE's mission expanded significantly since making that change, or is the focus still on individual rights in school?
So we have always kept the same mission, single issue, free speech, right? But we always got questions, is just getting at students for those 4 years enough, or just protecting universities enough to create a culture across the board, or questions like, are there issues with the K through 12 system putting students into the university and they don't understand simple First Amendment rights or academic freedom topics, so they're kind of going in and getting swept up in a liberal culture. So we said, okay, we hear you after all these years. So we expanded. And the change signified a mission expansion from just free speech in higher ed to free speech nationwide, right? So that issue didn't change, just the scope. And we didn't get rid of any of our higher ed programs. In fact, I think our higher ed staff has grown since, because the work hasn't stopped. But this expansion involved the launch of our public advocacy department. So we have a campus rights advocacy program. We've had it for years. It used to be called the Individual Rights Defense Program. And that's where we're defending, pro bono students and faculty rights on an advocacy basis, sometimes connecting them with our, lawyers in our legal network in all 50 states. We have our own internal litigation capacities. So we stood one up off of campus to defend the rights of, a student who wants to wear a Let's Go Brandon shirt to his elementary school field day, getting involved in book ban issues. We also expanded our research mandate. For a long time, FIRE we still do one of the biggest, college surveys on free speech and free expression, student opinion, et cetera. But now we're doing a national opinion poll on I believe it was weekly. I think we're shifting to monthly basis, just to measure the general public sentiment on free speech. And like I mentioned, we also had a huge increase in our litigation capacity, which now sees us in court representing citizen journalists. We were just, writing to the Supreme Court, got kicked back down to the Fifth Circuit, but we're fighting our way back up. We're defending, Iowa pollster Ann Seltzer from Donald Trump and more across the board. But I do want to emphasize, and as my title, should signal, we recognize that colleges play this incredibly vital role in preserving free thought in a free society. So to that end, we will always, and maybe I'm a little biased, Cody, but we will always place a special emphasis on defending the individual rights of students and faculty members on campus, because that's where we cut our teeth. And we do think that, for any good education, free speech is the foundation.
Well, yeah, and I think that, academia is also kind of an important pillar of, I think, creating society, particularly kind of from a more at the top level, right? Like, what are our politicians and journalists and, sort of intellectuals, how are they approaching these issues? So it's important, I think, to think about that. You did mention book bans, and that's been an interesting subject in the last few years, because there have been some kind of conservative, you have basically conservatives and progressives tend to see this differently, right? You've had some progressives trying to get books into schools, public schools, elementary schools, that talk about kind of LGBT stuff. And then you have some conservatives who reject that and also maybe point to some of the more extreme examples and saying, well, actually, some of this is arguably pornography, right? Mm-hmm. And so has FIRE gotten involved in any of that kind of stuff? Or
the K through 12 curriculum is tough, right? We understand that there are age concerns. A kindergarten library should realistically look a little different than a high school seniors library, for instance. But what we want to see is a transparent process across the board. And our issue will often come more when it kind of rolls out into a public library and what, a public library is displaying, what kind of events they're putting on, what they have on their shelves. So that's where most of our work focuses. But same thing, right? If you're going to go through this kind of process, we want transparency. We don't want, political grievance to be the side that's tipping. We want to see something a bit more substantive.
Yeah, because I assume, public colleges, we're talking about adults, whereas, younger than that, it's a little more complicated.
We get that question all the time, just from a pure rights standpoint. A K through 12 curriculum is often mandated by the state, right? A student has to meet certain benchmarks. I don't make me get into it, but standardized testing, all those, fun topics. But then once you get into a college classroom, individual faculty members have a lot more leeway to, design a course. Students get to kind of pick and choose what they're doing, even outside of their own major. So the kind of protections that they have to really pursue an idea or a topic changes. And that's why, we started in higher ed, because that's where the First Amendment protection should be some of the most substantive and substantial.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that makes sense to me. So when FIRE's, maybe arguably only focus was free speech on campuses, you became, I think, pretty well known for highlighting some liberal speech policies in American colleges and universities. Do you feel like there were certain specific cases that put you guys on the map, or that ended up maybe serving as important examples of what your mission was?
Yeah, there's a few. We could point back to are you familiar with the water buffalo incident? Well, I guess even if you are, your listeners might not be. Yeah. I sometimes forget when I'm doing a podcast or even a radio, I get sucked into the conversation. I forget that there's an outside purpose. So the water buffalo incident was probably FIRE's first case, but really before there was a fire. So the student, and I may, paraphrase around the edges here, because it was 1998, 99. The student, an Israeli student, was studying at the University of Pennsylvania in his dorm for finals or writing an essay or something, and there was a group of sorority girls outside the building being very loud. I don't know if it was an event or they were just out there being what 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-olds do, and a bunch of students were shouting out, and this student leaned out the window and shouted, "Shut up, you water buffalo." Now, he was an Israeli student. Turns out this was an all-black sorority, and these students decided that we're going to make a complaint to the university because this was a racial comment made at us. When security for the University of Pennsylvania went around and knocked on doors, the student happened to be the only one who said, "Yeah, it was me. I was yelling, and here's what I said." Now, I don't speak Hebrew or anything, but apparently a term for kind of a loud, rowdy person almost directly translates to water buffalo. So he wasn't using it as a racial epithet. He was just, making the closest translation. And university administrators kind of egged on this kind of hate harassment case, and it dragged on for a long time. And he ended up linking up with Alan Charles Kors, one of FIRE's founders, who at the time and then even after founding FIRE was a professor there. And Kors was representing him in, university disciplinary situations, going to the New York ACLU, the New York Civil Liberties Union, all these other entities, and saying, "Can someone find me anywhere where water buffalo has been used as a racial phrase?" And they couldn't. But it really wasn't a campus disciplinary process that actually won the day. It was that outside pressure of bringing this kind of, the student said a thing, didn't mean a racial offense, but now it's being dragged in that direction, and kind of look at the silliness speech codes have wrought now. So that was kind of what launched FIRE. If I am, picking and choosing my own preferred case, Kevin Shaw, I think this was 2015, 2016. He was a student at Pierce College, which is a small part of the Los Angeles Community College system. And the LA Community College system at the time had something like 150,000 students. And he was handing out little pocket constitutions. I know I have one on my shelf. I'm sure you and most of your listeners have a ton. Just handing those out on campus. And they said, "No, you can't do that. But you can go to this tiny, tiny free speech zone And FIRE did the math. The free speech zone represented 0.003% of campus. You can't do that on a public university campus. You can't say this little thing that's the size of a parking space is, your where you can distribute the Constitution, where you can use your free speech rights. And that kind of kicked off FIRE's first lawsuit in what we called the Million Voices litigation campaign, which was really targeted at combating the concept of a free speech zone, especially on public university campuses. So that's one of my favorites.
Yeah. I wouldn't call myself a connoisseur of racial slurs or anything, but I've never heard water buffalo used in a racial context. That's interesting. But that sort of shows, I think, where the university is putting their thumb on the scale to kind of push things in a certain direction to try to silence free speech and silence. I think sounds like really even just debate on what was happening.
Yeah, we've seen it for decades. Speech codes. Everyone hears speech codes, and you should get a chill in your spine, right? Because for a speech code to exist, it needs to kind of rely on a double standard, right? It needs to rely on there being protected speech that is unacceptable here. But also, right. You look into it, and it's something that I'm not a lawyer. I've worked really hard not to get a law degree in my life. I work with so many talented lawyers, but something I will always laugh at. I look at, a reasonable person may find offensive language in university speech codes. I like to think I'm reasonable. My wife may say I'm not, but I'm sure what I find offensive is going to be different than what you find offensive or what my wife finds offensive. So I don't know how you govern an institution based on something like that. But we see those weaponized all the time on campus to squash speech, the administration or leadership or, even a loud minority of students don't like.
Yeah, well, and I mean, years ago, I remember this was, I think, when I became really aware of FIRE, some of these cases about conservatives inviting someone onto campus, even somebody who was kind of inflammatory, like Milo Yiannopoulos. And you'd have, progressive demonstrators who would really try to shout down, shut down, make threats. Mm-hmm. And the universities would side with people who are trying to silence. They would sort of say, like, we understand and your feelings are more important than, than free speech. And so, like, I think some of this stuff became, I think, just kind of headline type stuff. And so FIRE, I think, really made a name for itself as being a group that was willing to take some of that stuff on head on. So
we're starting, and it's so easy. And sorry for interrupting you, Cody, but it is so easy to like latch onto that and get negative. As a born and raised pessimist, I get it. We're actually starting to see some really positive stuff in the other direction. Schools like Dartmouth, an Ivy League. I never thought I'd be on a show like this, praising an Ivy League school. They're starting to develop programs to train administrators, senior level faculty. And I forget the specific name that they call it. But basically, how to ensure an event goes off without a hitch while also ensuring a counter-protest can function. And any student group who's doing any kind of event like this at Dartmouth can request one of these administrators to attend. And it's such a great idea because it allows every group to, go through their expressive activities, keeps them in protected boundaries, and prevents the university from having to clamp down. Because, frankly, it's a rough spot to be in. So these preventative and these educational measures ahead, awesome. University of South Carolina, they 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, were in like the bottom little percent of our college free speech rankings, which I hope we can get into some. They went through a huge policy rewrite. They redid their kind of core philosophical statement on free expression and communicated it to the students every step of the way. And then what do you know, the very next semester, I believe it was the Turning Point USA chapter. I might be wrong there, but it was a right-leaning student org. They wanted to do a roast of Kamala Harris leading up to the presidential election. And there were so many calls for, you can't do this. It's going to be a problem, hate speech, all that. And the university said, nah, and just, pointed to their new commitment to free expression. And what do you know? It went off without a hitch. And then in our following ranking cycle, we saw huge increases in students' belief in the university to protect free speech, in students' understanding of the boundaries of free speech, of students' non-support for using violence or shout downs to stop speech. So it's amazing what, institutional leadership can do when it doesn't just talk the talk, but it can, follow it up with the walking the walk, I guess is the best way to say it.
Yeah. And I think that's what, a lot of, I think, maybe older folks especially sort of saw when they looked at what's been happening at these colleges and universities is that administrators are sort of afraid to be the adults in the room because they see students as customers, which is understandable, and they're trying to kind of keep the customers happy.
Yeah.
But in doing so, you've turned what the environment of the university is supposed to be, an environment of free inquiry, into something else. So that's cool. I like that they're doing a free speech sensitivity training, I suppose you could call it.
I don't want to agree with you, but I'll give it to you next.
Okay, so this is the Libertarian Christian Podcast, and some libertarian purists would argue that what we should be shooting for is this ideal of private colleges and universities, which would not necessarily, they would really maybe treat students more as customers, and they would not necessarily be in favor of free speech in the same way, or at least be required to be or expected to be. And so, from that view, from that point of view, could FIRE's work be seen as kind of a stopgap? While we have public universities, they should be free environments. But another question is, even in these kind of more private environments, FIRE, I think, has also been pushing for maybe like a culture of free speech. So I'd be curious to kind of hear how that all washes out in your thought.
So it's a really interesting question, and I'm going to use the excuse of being a purely nonpartisan organization that has never and will never comment on the content of speech we defend to say I can't comment on the libertarian purist argument. I'd love to chat about it at some point, but it's one I've never really thunk through and debated myself. But for FIRE, and I think this will play across regardless of how you view the university system. In our mind, universities can only function at their full potential with maximum protections for free speech. And I'll give you two real specific reasons, right? We've all heard the marketplace of ideas. So it was Justice Oliver Holmes, I think. And he wrote, I'm now going to butcher his quote after butchering his name, but something like, the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the market. So in a college campus, that means the only way to figure out what's true is by letting ideas compete openly, fully, without the administration gatekeeping certain conversations. And then even if, truth doesn't win right away, free speech still plays such an important role to get there eventually. And that's what FIRE's President Greg Lukianoff calls the informational theory of speech. So he says speech helps us understand what people actually believe, even when those beliefs are troubling. And, without it, we're flying blind. We can't diagnose a problem or push for change. And our Bostonian other co-founder, Harvey Silverglade, puts it, I wish I could do his accent, but he'll tell you, I walk into a room, I want to know who the Nazis are so I don't turn my back to them. Right? So just knowing the world as it is, whether it's a scientific study, whether it's someone you're befriending, whether it's a potential relationship, knowing who they are, what they think has value. And then on a college campus where you're, the number one goal should be the, discovery and dissemination of knowledge. You can't do that if suddenly there are certain guidelines, guardrails, or boundaries put on the exact lines of inquiry or even what you can discuss. It's why, there are some organizations out there, Hillsdale College, pretty good. If you want American government or history education, I'll say they're pretty solid. I went to a sister school of Hillsdale that does a lot of their work, but they don't actually have a free speech promise on the books. They also don't take federal money. So there's no Title VI, no Title IX concerns. They're a private institution. They're not bound by the First Amendment. But above any commitment they make to free speech is a civility oath. So basically they say, real discourse, real dialogue can only fully function if we're civil. But then I'll go back to that what a rational person may find offensive. I think reasonable people can disagree on what civil dialogue is. So it gets really messy. So for FIRE, the bottom line is if we really want to pursue knowledge to wherever the end is going to be, we need full protections for that discussion, for that research, and for that expression.
Yeah, no, and I like what you said about, when you walk in a room, you want to know who the Nazis are. I think there's this sense that, the kind of illiberal and censorious people have that if people aren't allowed to tell you what they think, that means they're not thinking things that are bad, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, well, no, they are, you just don't know it, right? And so there's, I think speech is kind of a lagging indicator of thought, right? And so if you want to know what people are thinking and you want to be able to address what they're saying and what they have what's wrong with their thought process. You have to be able to hear what they have to say.
Frederick Douglass, in, oh geez, I'm not even going to guess on the year, but he gave a speech titled "A Plea for Free Speech" in Boston, where he called free speech the great moral renovator of society and government. Right, the idea of where injustice is found, where people think there's an issue, speech calls it out, and where speech calls out injustice, change can be made. Right, so you just move that to education. If you don't think we have the answer, someone needs to ask the question to get us closer to the answer.
Yeah, that's good. Well, so since expanding the mission, what kind of work has Fire taken on they might have not taken on before?
A ton. We actually early on in our expansion realized the amount of pure questions we were getting that were suddenly in our new wheelhouse was substantial. So we put together these really, I call them fun, but maybe I'm just a little crazy, these rapid response meetings where every morning some, leadership across various fire departments will get together and analyze kind of the news of the day and figure out Fire's position. That's been cut down a little bit now that we're, 2-3 years into this and we've learned a lot of our new positions. But we're taking on cases. I mentioned Let's Go Brandon, a middle schooler attended a field day with a Let's Go Brandon, the euphemism for F Joe Biden. I don't know the audience rating for this, so I'll say F unless I'm told otherwise. Right. And we, represented them because they're sent home from field day. You can't do that. It's an inflammatory shirt. Well, no, it's political messaging. We have, decisions like Tinker that, allow students to wear these things. I mentioned we're representing Ann Seltzer. She was the Iowa pollster who predicted Donald Trump was going to lose Iowa by 13 points. Obviously, that didn't happen. Now, Trump and another organization in Iowa are suing her. We're representing Ann. I mentioned some book ban cases. We've taken on, some of my favorites have been town council issues. Franklin, Tennessee, they had a LGBTQ pride parade that they did every year for a long time. And a new permit was requested to do it again. And they said, you know what, we're gonna hold off on deciding on the permit. And first we're gonna debate whether or not we should put in a town behavioral ordinance to determine what kind of behavior is acceptable and civil and meets our community decency standards. And then again, who gets to decide what's decent in the community? Well, the 5 people on this board of aldermen. So, we said, no, you can't do that. It's unconstitutional. If you're going to make these calls, they need to be done on a viewpoint neutral way, not based on what you consider decent behavior, et cetera. So those have been fun, all over the place, picking up cases with First Amendment auditors who are, making sure police are following the law when it comes to First Amendment rights. We just launched a case, Allentown, Pennsylvania, where a gentleman was out on a public sidewalk filming police officers, and the video shows a member of the police driving onto the curb, in his direction, and saying, you can't film me from this public space. So it's been really interesting. And, we could go down any number of those rabbit holes, but it's, if you thought our breadth on campus was pretty wide, it's, quadruple that off of campus.
Right. Well, and just maybe another question about kind of the expansiveness of Fire's mission. You referenced, different cases where, you supported people from across the political spectrum. But I think one of the things that's been a surprise for many, and you can correct me when I use this word, is that most, I think, of the policies that you push back against, especially in schools, have targeted conservatives. And so the left has, traditionally been associated with free speech policies and seems to maybe have come back around to that mission a little bit more lately over concerns about, conservatives banning books in public schools and legal immigrants being deported over criticism of Israel, stuff like that. Do you think that at this stage of American political discourse, free speech is a partisan issue? And this is maybe just your opinion. I don't know that Fire's put out anything like this. What grades would you give the political left and the political right on free speech right now?
Those are really good and really tough questions. I think free speech has become a partisan issue insofar as both sides of the aisle like to sweep it under the rug when possible, right? If there's an opportunity to push their agenda and disregard free speech protections, it seems to happen. For a grade, not good. Yeah, I have a tough time looking at the Biden years and saying, what good speech protective thing came out of the Biden administration, it's tough to find. And then with Trump 2.0, we've seen some of the greatest attacks on free speech on and off campus in my lifetime. Just to point to one, that student Ozturk, I always forget her first name, so forgive me, but at Tufts University, writes an op-ed basically endorsing, not even her own opinion, just endorsing the student government's, BDS push. And she gets grabbed by plainclothes officers and thrown in the back of a car and arrested for an op-ed. And when, the trial was going and they wanted evidence, the only evidence submitted was the op-ed. Right, so she was an international student. Law says international.
And to be clear, that's evidence that she may be like a terrorist sympathizer.
Yeah, bingo. Because an op-ed she wrote, and Tufts University, to their credit, issued a really funny statement where they said, if you look at that issue of the student paper, you will find more inflammatory language coming from other students on this exact same point than Ozturk's. And it was kind of a bland article, but I can't think of much more un-American action than arresting someone for words on paper, right? If this was an actual violent protester or, putting money behind a terrorist organization, that's a different conversation. But pure expression. But to hit your first point, for a long time, FIRE had what we called a marriage of convenience with conservatives on campus. And it's because, free speech is always going to be a tool of the minority. You get 51%, you have the muscle power, you have the votes, right? You don't need persuasion. You need persuasion when you're in the minority. So for a long time, conservatives were out of power. They were the minority in the student population, definitely the minority in the faculty, definitely in the administration. So we were probably, if I had to guess, I'm not a betting man, but I would bet decent money we've helped out more Turning Point USA chapters than college Democrats, just because they're the ones, in the minority with the kind of calls for censorship coming. And that script is kind of flipped off campus. We find ourselves in more red states defending, town, regular people trying to talk at a town council meeting and getting shouted down or kicked out. There was a dad in Uvalde, Texas, who went to the school board meeting to ask questions about, the hiring of security guards for the school. And he was dragged out and arrested just for trying to ask questions and exercise his speech rights. Something that has happened, and it's kind of the beauty of FIRE's spot right in the middle. We don't comment on the speech we defend, we comment on its constitutionality, but it means we're getting just kind of bludgeoned with the pendulum when it swings back and forth. But every time it swings back, we get a few people on that other side who say, wait a minute, maybe FIRE is onto something. So I was just talking about, some of the really bad stuff coming from the Trump administration. That Overton window has shifted, and suddenly people who thought FIRE might have been, screaming the sky's falling a year or two ago are now saying, wait a minute, maybe FIRE was reasonable here, all things, considered. And we're having a ton of success now working in tandem with college administrators, college faculty coming on board in greater numbers, which is great. I wish, we could have gotten their house in order 5 years ago, but, we're going to be here and we're going to be consistent. So I'll take whoever wants to come when they want to come.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. There's too many people who only care about free speech when they're in the minority.
Mm-hmm. Hey everyone, it's Doug from LCI. As you may know, the team at Podsworth Media has worked with us for a long time, producing our content for most of the Christians for Liberty network. A big part of that over the past couple of years has been using the Podsworth app to make our audio sound clean, level, and professional, even when the raw recordings were super sketchy, like this one you're listening to right now. Believe it or not, this recording was that bad before I ran it through the Podsworth app, and you can hear the full before and after demo yourself at podsworth.com. The app recently got a huge update, and it's now better than ever. So good, in fact, that it can take almost any atrocious voice recording and make it sound great. Here's how it works. It removes background noise, cuts down on plosives, fixes clipping when your gain is too high, removes clicks and pops, reduces reverb, improves tone, and levels out the dialogue so that you don't get any crazy volume jumps. Everybody hates that in a podcast. Using it is super simple. You just go to podsworth.com and click Get Started, drag and drop the audio files, open them right up from your phone's browser, customize your settings however you want, but honestly, the default works great for most settings, and here's a really cool thing. If you enter code LCI50, you'll get 50% off your first order. No account needed, just your email and payment. You'll get a download link in your inbox with cleaned up files. It's perfect for podcasts, YouTube videos, sermons, audiobooks, you name it. If your recording sounds rough, the Podsworth app can make it not only sound listenable, but professional. And remember, when you use code LCI50, you get half off your first order, and you'll also be supporting the work here at LCI.
Do you think that, because we mentioned the case about the op-ed, do you think that non-citizens should be given the same free speech protections? And I think, my inclination would be to say yes, but there's an argument, I think, that has some weight to it that, if you're bringing in people that you find out are expressing support for terrorist organizations, maybe they're not criminals themselves, but they're bringing that kind of point of view, people who don't actually share our belief in freedom. I mean, should there be free speech? I mean, should there be like kind of tests like that for who's allowed to be here?
The Supreme Court, I believe in 1945, said freedom of speech and of press is accorded to aliens residing in this country. So should they have these protections? Absolutely. When you get into illegal conduct, that's different. But a lot of what we're seeing aren't, I'm going to go march in the streets and try to burn something down. It's, protected protest on campus. Some are going too far. Fire will be the first to say, building occupations, some encampments, preventing students from accessing parts of campus, go far beyond protected speech. And, if that is what the charges are going to be, that's fine, but bring them. We haven't seen that yet. There was the Khalil case at Columbia. He was a student protester at Columbia, didn't wear a mask. He was one of the ones more upfront and open, willing to be like a public-faced negotiator with the administration. When, they were going through his trial, show us evidence of actual unlawful conduct, and we only got expressive conduct. We got, he was at this protest. Not, he was busting down the doors of this administrative building and, occupying it. So I think there's a clear distinction there. And then again, the First Amendment protects advocacy of violence as long as it doesn't cross the line into that conduct. So was it 2 years ago now? I think 2022, when the Harvard, MIT, and Penn president were in front of the Anti-Semitism Committee in Congress and were asked, are calls for violence protected speech? And a lot of them said it depends on the context or yes. And it's true. The problem is, you can only really rely on it depends on the context answer when you have consistently shown to follow the free speech line. And these schools have historically been really bad at it. So, a bad time to be called a hypocrite, rightfully so in my mind. But so I have a tough time as a pure free speech advocate. Show me the conduct and it's a different conversation. If we're just talking about un-American ideas, right? Our country was founded on the premise of criticizing a politician and a ruling government, right? Yeah. I kind of want to see that in our country. I want to get better. Was it John Stuart Mill who said if you can't debate your idea, it's no better than a dogma or a conspiracy theory?
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, if we were having a conversation about Congress people who were advocating for attacking another country, and is that protected speech? That would be an interesting conversation to have.
That is a very interesting conversation. Who's going to ask me that question?
Okay, so there was a case I thought was interesting in 2023. It was a case that Fire intervened in, involving a high school student who received detention for refusing to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And that's an interesting case to me because I was also a high school student who refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And there was also an really interesting Supreme Court case in 1943. I know you said you run a lawyer, but I'd be curious to hear what you think about this. Over a school district expelling Jehovah's Witness students for refusing to say the pledge. And there was also, I think, a lot of general hostility and bullying. You kind of had the community sort of turn against these kind of Jehovah's Witness families and their communities, even some violence. And so in light of SCOTUS president, how did that become an issue again in 2023? Is this just issues where schools just don't really understand the law and the protections that that these kids have of free speech, or what's happening there?
I think there's a Two questions. First, let's address the first one. And I pulled up the quote because it's so good, and I've butchered quotes already the past 30 minutes we've been talking. So from that court case, Justice Robert Jackson, writing for the majority, said, quote, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein." And I think that is such a good kind of fixed star. So people, you could take that to the DEI conversation, right? FIRE doesn't care about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. What we care about is when you're trying to mandate a faculty member, sign a statement that prescribes the faculty member to the university's definition of DEI, right? That's compelled speech. So at our core, at the core of the First Amendment protections is a protection against a citizen like you or I being forced to parrot a belief of the government. And that trickles all the way down to the Pledge of Allegiance. Why we keep seeing it, come back, I think on one hand, pride in our country is pretty good. So I think some people at least have the right intentions, right? They want, what we've built here to, be recognized and preserved. I get that. But on the other hand, I don't think we're doing a good enough job educating on the kind of norms around First Amendment rights and the protections therein. And we're seeing it all the time, right? On the college campus, I was saying we're graduating students from K through 12 without a strong civic background and expecting them to function. We're also not educating them on these things on a college campus, so they're going right into the workforce. And then they're the ones making these calls in a K through 12 system. So it's this vicious cycle. Right. And until we really start taking these things seriously and educating accordingly, it's one of the first things that a university administrator asks, what can I do to get students in line? First off, I hate that kind of get in line language, but I say, you have a captive audience, especially at orientation. Teach them the boundaries. Tell them, because they've never been told before. So if you don't outline protected versus unprotected and how to do it properly, they're just going to go with the flow. And the flow has been going in a bad direction for a long time.
Yeah, no, I like what you that quotation from the Supreme Court case, because I think there's the sense that if you force kids to say the pledge, somehow you're creating a more patriotic student body. Like if you make someone say the pledge, that doesn't mean you've convinced them to love America. You've just forced them to keep their dissent private, and Of course, patriotism isn't real, and it doesn't make America greater by creating it. You mentioned this kind of earlier, and I'd like to get into it a little bit more. FIRE produces these regular campus free speech rankings, and the most recent one, and this might be out a bit after this has come out, so there might be a little bit of a delay on this, but at the time that we're talking, FIRE has just released a spotlight on speech codes. I think that if you search Spotlight on Speech Codes 2025, you'll be able to find it.
Yes, sir.
And so maybe let's say I'm a TLDR, too long don't read, didn't read kind of person. What's the long and short of it? Is the climate of free speech improving or getting worse?
Yes, and no is the really crummy answer I'm going to give you here. So FIRE does two big campus reports. One is Spotlight, which we rate the speech codes, speech policies on just under 500 college campuses on a red, yellow, green light scale. Red being, terrible for speech, arguably unconstitutional in public. Yellow being that rational person language I keep coming back to for some reason. Ones that are ripe for abuse or, could potentially be applied arbitrarily. And then green, very speech protective, good. And then the second one is the college free speech rankings, and I'll get to that in a second. On the Spotlight ratings, we, for the first time in our history, have more green light schools than red light. Now, that means, we're going in the right direction. There's still a huge batch of yellow, but like purely speech restrictive policies are going away, and that's good. Now, I said good and bad because that's great, right? Just like a country, if you don't have a foundation of laws and norms, your culture is going to be questionable. On a college campus, without foundational policies, speech protective policies, you're never going to get to that free speech culture question. So we like to see policies as step one, right? But it's just a stepping stone. It's just the foundation. The second big thing, if you don't mind me getting into it, Cody, is the college free speech rankings, which is comprised of three components, one of which is the Spotlight rating. The second is the largest student survey of free speech, opinion and beliefs out there. This past year, just over 255 schools and over 68,000 students surveyed. And we ask, about tolerance for speakers of different political persuasions on campus. We ask, students' support for shouting down speakers. We ask, how much do they self-censor on campus? And then the third component of the rankings is a kind of administrative action category. So how often are, students and scholars being sanctioned and punished for protective speech? How often are shout downs or disinvitations successful on campus? We try to give points. So we give points if, like that South Carolina example from before, if there are calls to cancel, a speaking event or something like that, and the university says, here we value free speech, and they give a strong kind of rebuttal and position their university as a speech first kind of campus, we'll give bonus points. This upcoming year, we'll release probably in early September, we're going to give some bonus points for schools that have adopted a good free speech statement, like the Chicago Statement on Free Expression, or have adopted, institutional neutrality, a commitment not to weigh in on social or political issues. And here's where the bad comes. So while policies and the foundation on campuses are getting a lot better, the acceptability of shouting down a speaker, blocking entry to an event, and physically using violence to stop speech have ticked up slightly, and slightly sucks, but they're also all record highs now. So students, thinking it is acceptable to, Cody Cook comes to campus, I'm going to go and shout down every time you try to talk because I don't think you deserve the platform. Not good. We also, for the first time in our history, a majority of students opposed allowing all of the controversial speakers we proposed. So we split them into, conservative Democrat, a student, a speaker who's coming to say Black Lives Matter is a hate group, or a speaker coming and saying we should allow, any student or anyone, no matter what their age, are to get gender affirming care. Students across the board are saying no to controversial speakers. Those are not good signs for a culture. So it is this weird middle ground of where, I think universities have got with the program and realized there's a serious problem, but the cultural issue of students, that's very downstream, and we need to make sure that catches up.
Yeah. I hear that. Are explicitly religious schools that might require a statement of faith, are they included in these rankings, or is this focused more on public college and universities?
We did. I mentioned Hillsdale earlier. Mm-hmm. So we have a category called a warning school where historically, we're not doing it this year, where we would survey, schools like Baylor, Pepperdine, Hillsdale. Hillsdale's not religious, but they have that civility. So schools that are private, they have this religious commitment. BYU is another good example. They're allowed to do that, right? We don't make a judgment on whether or not they can freely associate, right? It's a protected right. We just, the primary focus of our ranking are for prospective students and parents to kind of get a snapshot view of the climate on campus. So we, in previous years, would survey them and include all their data, but just pull them out of the rankings and say, here's what you're getting. We included quotes from the students, anything you get at another school, but we just didn't want to rank them because it didn't seem fair, right? To put a BYU with a religious commitment next to a school like Purdue, for instance.
Because totally, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think I went to a private kind of a conservative theological school, and I think that there's value in doing that, associating with people that you sort of have something that you want to work on, where you sort of have things in common. As long as you understand that that's what you're getting going into.
That's what you're getting, and that's
right.
The big one.
Yeah.
We don't want students to be sold a wrong bill of goods, I guess.
Yeah. You don't want to think I'm going to go to Yale and I'm going to get this sort of free environment of inquiry, and then that's not what you get.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've heard some FIRE supporters say that FIRE is like the new ACLU. That the ACLU used to be known for defending free speech in all of its forms. They would defend, even the rights of, neo-Nazis and stuff. But that the ACLU has arguably abdicated that responsibility in recent years to just basically promote progressive politics. And so FIRE has kind of come in and taken up that free speech mantle. Is that how you think of FIRE, or do you see it differently?
So the ACLU, they still do good work, and we partner with them often on amicus briefs and other casework. The difficult thing for them that FIRE doesn't have to deal with is they have 16 or 17 different issue areas, and when you're juggling that many different priorities, naturally things are going to have to fall behind. So are they Are they picking one day, reproductive rights over speech, or are they going to pick, speech over reproductive rights? That's not a decision I'd ever want to make. It's why I like FIRE being a single issue organization. And, actually right before our expansion in a New York Times article, the former free speech director at the National ACLU said that FIRE had kind of grown so quickly on college campuses because of that, right? Because we were laser focused on one issue. So we kind of took that as okay, they recognize that, we do too. Maybe that can help with our expansion because we were so lasered in, we could fill in the holes that might have been missing because the ACLU was spread thin on 16, 17. I may be missing one or two there, but more priorities than FIRE has. And it's their choice. We here are a bunch of, free speechers, for better or worse. It's one of the most politically diverse, organizations I've ever worked for, but we're so on that singular mission. It is a fascinating building.
Yeah, it is. Well, I think too, once even if an organization cares a lot about free speech, if they've aligned themselves as, we're on the left or whatever, or on the right, there's a lot of issues on the left and right that the people conservatives and progressives care about that actually could be sort of conflict with free speech.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you balance those conflicts? I think it becomes a difficult question.
It's why we have never and will never. We've defended you name a political belief, we've probably defended someone on that side of the aisle. Everything from socialists to Republicans to, the Church of Satan, to religious student orgs, but we don't comment on it. For us, speech is protected or not. We will editorialize around a story, right? Because everyone loves the story of the underdog triumphing over, a censorial government. We're never going to touch the content, because the minute we start dipping our toes in the content, or it'd be a damn shame if we ever said that speech is yucky, but it's still protected. We undermine our own arguments.
Yeah. Well, I would assume Satanists would always be welcome in the FIRE. So I was kidding.
I guess I'll take that as a compliment, Cody.
No. I'm glad that you guys are defending them too. At least their speech. So, well, to be clear, their freedom of speech. But that being said, you have had some, people you defend that have been more controversial. And we talked earlier about how, at least on campuses, that tended to sort of skew toward the right. And there are some who would accuse FIRE of being essentially a right-wing movement. And it seems like, I think you've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I might ask more directly. I mean, do you think there's any validity to that charge? You mentioned kind of a marriage of convenience with conservatives on school issues in the past, but that might not be the case on some of these more local government levels.
We're always going to get it, right? It's a natural problem with being a nonpartisan single issue. And it's something we also are you familiar with O'Sullivan's Law? Have you heard of this?
I don't know.
So it's our FIRE's president CEO, Greg Lukianoff, talks about this a lot. I believe it originated, across the Atlantic in the UK, but it's the idea that any nonprofit organization that isn't explicitly right-leaning will inevitably drift left over time. And we've taken that concern to heart. FIRE for a long time, you had Greg Lukianoff at the top as a pretty public liberal atheist, and his number two guy was a Christian Trumper. And we kind of practice that. It's one of the only places where in the interview, we try to get at, I don't care what your politics are, but I care, why you are coming to free speech and how you're going to handle defending someone from the other side of the spectrum. So we look for that kind of political swing in our hiring because we don't want to be on one side or the other. We want to be able to sit around a table and always have someone disagree. The most uncomfortable thing here at FIRE is when we're looking at a case and everyone's in agreement. And it could be because it's just a clear-cut, violation of someone's First Amendment rights, but we still take a step back and go, wait a minute, we're all agreeing. Is there something we're missing? And I don't think you get that at a lot of nonprofits. We look for political diversity to make sure we're being persuasive to every audience and we're chasing down every lead and not putting those kind of partisan blinders on. So I always ask people, show me cases that you think FIRE should have gotten involved in or we didn't. People will point to Palestinian or Israeli support on college campuses, and I have a laundry list of cases. But it is natural. Our work is always going to piss somebody off. and we'll make them a friend the next day just to piss them off again come, next Monday. But, the world needs that kind of straight shooter here, and our tent is big enough for anyone who wants to come in. Because I'm sure for every case you may not like that we take, we'll have one in our history that really liked.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is a slightly silly question, but I'll ask it anyway because it's good to create little 15-second clips for YouTube. Your organization is called Fire. Do we actually have a right to yell fire in a crowded theater?
Yes, but so that line gets misquoted all the time, right? What it actually is, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man for falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing a panic, right? So two things are missing from that. First, it has to be false. If there is a fire, why would you get in trouble for alerting everyone that there is a fire? But moreover, it has to cause a panic. So, if you are falsely, sure, and then you're causing a panic and people get hurt, of course. But if there's a fire, you can absolutely shout fire in a crowded theater. You can warn people if there's a fire in a crowded theater, if there is a fire.
Got it. You guys have been kind of charting kind of free speech for a while at this point. So I imagine you're seeing some trends and you have some suspicions about maybe where things are moving. Where do you think most of the battles over free speech are going to be in the future? Let's say the next 10 years.
I will give you my current boogeyman. The government, under both Biden and Trump, is operating under this kind of new cumulative theory of harassment, and it's really threatening campus speech and student and faculty rights. So the idea is that schools can now be punished under Title VI. Title VI is the protecting from racial, ethnic discrimination for not cracking down on constitutionally protected speech. It's a weird one, right? So basically they're saying, here's a singular instance of protected speech that someone might label as harassment. Historically, harassment on a college campus needs to be severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive to deny a student access to equal education opportunities, right? That's a high bar. It's three different things. The and's important. They're now saying that hostile environment of harassment can be formed if you take 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 individual instances, which may be protected or may not. Each one's facts may be different, but the schools don't know at what point they're going to hit that number and suddenly, oh no, we have a hostile environment on our hands. So if I'm running a college or university, I'm terrified of this imaginary number because I don't know when I'm going to potentially meet it. So I'm going to start, clamping down on protected speech to ensure we never get there. It creates this silence first, ask questions later mindset. So instead of serving as this real place of intellectual risk taking, campuses are going to start looking more like compliance departments, almost in an effort not to potentially step out of line. So, to real world example here, if you look at the Columbia accusations before the recent resolution, which has some issues in and of itself, if you look at the accusations of what caused this, Title VI discriminatory environment, 50-50 on whether or not each instance is protected speech or not. But by lumping them all up, they've created this big monstrosity. So I'm worried that is going to be weaponized to continue this kind of extortion campaign that Trump's on. But we saw it in the Biden years too. And it's going to cause more bureaucrats to be hired by colleges and universities, which is never a good thing. And then these bureaucrats are going to be justifying their jobs by, shushing protected speech just to make sure that they don't accidentally, get the government spotlight when they hit that imaginary number and they, are suddenly fall in that cumulative harassment window. So that is my boogeyman right now.
And so somebody who wants to research that more, it's referred to as cumulative harassment?
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. It's a shift. We've seen, and sorry for going on a bit more, but an issue we've seen, come any real government first reform targeting colleges and universities, they kind of have to acknowledge first that they helped colleges and universities get to the point of being this bad, right? I've been doing this work for 8-9 years, and I've seen multiple different definitions of harassment coming out of the government. When you have that flip-flop, you suddenly need to staff campus administrative departments to make sure they're compliant. And then these people, need to justify their jobs and make sure they stay compliant. So, speech police suddenly come out, right? So the government, in trying to do some of these things, has a tendency to go too far and cause greater problems that are going to just, keep me employed 5 years down the road, unfortunately.
Gotcha. So FIRE it's kind of this last half of 2025 is releasing a few books, or at least is involved in the release of a few books. And so as we speak, the most recent is by Greg Lukianoff, who I believe you said is your president. Is that the title? Who also worked on that great book with Jonathan Haidt on what's the name of the book?
The Coddling of the American Mind.
That's right, Coddling of the American Mind.
I don't know if you've read the follow-up book, The Canceling of the American Mind.
I haven't, but it's on my list. I'll get to it. The Coddling is great.
Feel stuck with the American Mind language now.
Right. So that's got to be it. Yeah, I had a couple cousins who graduated high school and are going into college, and I got them copies of that, the Coddling book. And so he wrote that with this new book with Nadine Strawson called The War on Words, 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail. That one just came out, right? And there's a couple other ones too, including one about the ACLU's defense of the neo-Nazis, I think in Skokie.
Yeah, we're republishing, Defending, I'm going to step to the side.
Yeah.
I have it printed off. We're republishing Defending My Enemies by Ari Nair.
Okay.
It's a book that came out, I don't remember the original date, and I wonder if I can get it, 1979. It has been published. You could still find copies, but they were like $300-$400 a pop. And, it's such an important story to tell, right? Like being willing to defend someone who, wants you to not exist anymore is such a powerful story that we wanted to bring that out. So we're, Defending My Enemy by Ari Nair is getting a republication. Sarah McLaughlin on our team, she's our senior fellow in global free expression. She publishes the Free Speech Dispatch once a month, which covers international censorship stories. She has a book coming out in August, I believe, called Authoritarians in the Academy, which is talking about Chinese influence on American universities, which will be a very interesting one.
And this is not Sarah McLaughlin, the folk singer.
No, unfortunately for the folk singer, ours is publishing a book, and I get to talk about it, which is fun.
Yeah. Well, I think the folk singer is tied up with the ASPCA right now, or whatever it is.
Oh, yeah, that is her, isn't she?
Yeah.
Okay. Cody, I have to confess, my pop culture knowledge is like 30 years behind.
Most of mine is too. But if you ever want to talk about Don Rickles or James Mason or something, give me a call.
Yeah, that's my right there, Lenny Bruce. Let's.
So speaking of these books, specifically the one that just came out as we're recording this, The War on Words, and we talked a little about the Skokie book, or the neo-Nazis. I mean, why should somebody who's a libertarian Christian, for example, check these books out? What will they find in them?
You're going to find, a consistent. Anyone who's engaged in political discourse, anyone who is talking about free speech is going to inevitably hear things like, words are violence, hate speech isn't protected, right? Like all these same old cliches. And what Greg and Nadine Strawson, former head of the ACLU, who helped write these books, they did. There's like, all right, what are the 10 arguments that we roll our eyes at when we hear? And how can we get a succinct response together with case citations, with all the kind of data backup you may need to go to the Thanksgiving dinner table and argue with your family, and put it in this condensed, the war language makes me laugh in the title, because it's really what it is, right? It's giving you the ammunition you need to beat back these bad arguments, but that's exactly what it is. All right, so anyone who cares about these issues, if you want some of my personal favorite thinkers on these issues to kind of spoon feed you an argument to kind of counter things like, hate speech isn't protected or words are violence, this book is for you. It is a short, fun read. Greg is a character. He always is able to connect the free speech principles to things I love, whether it's comic books or old Russian history. And, Nadine, if you've never watched Nadine Strawson talk about free speech, it's one of the most inspiring things you're ever gonna be able to listen to.
Awesome. So you recommend them then?
Oh, well, of course.
Yeah.
We'll buy all the copies, 5-star reviews on Amazon or wherever your place of purchase of choice is.
Yeah. So The War on Words is out now. By the time this releases, the next one might be out, which was the one on by Sarah McLachlan, I think. Is that the one you're talking about?
Authoritarians in the Academy, sometime in mid to late August.
Okay. And then the third book, Defending My Enemy?
Yeah, I don't actually know the date on that. That is a shame on me moment.
I have a bookmark that I got at Freedom Fest that tells me, but I don't have it with me right now.
Great.
But that's the third book, though.
Notes.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes. That's the third book coming out this year. Yeah. So that probably won't be out by the time people are hearing this, if they're hearing it on the first release.
And then coming up in 2026, if you'll allow me to, because this one I am personally interested in, our Executive Vice President, Nico Perino, basically is doing an oral history on the old free speech movement. He's interviewed a ton of Ari Nair, Nadine Strauss, and Ira Glasser, a lot of old ACLU folks, old free speech civil libertarians, and he's kind of telling the story of that free speech generation and what we're in danger of losing. But it's all done through personal interviews with those that are still around.
Oh, that sounds cool. Yeah. Okay, so where can folks find the work of FIRE? How do they support it?
You can find us online at thefire.org, www.thefire.org. Also on almost any social media platform you could think of at thefire.org. We have a membership program, $25 and up. It gets you in. We do things like rapid response, news about a Harvard court case. You can hop on with our experts. We do a monthly kind of open Q&A with any member who can come and sit in with it's a rotating cast of FIRE characters, and we just take questions for an hour. It's one of the most exhausting but fun parts of the job, I think. Anyone who wants to can come ask. But more importantly, just get involved, pay attention, look, know your rights, look around. If you see something a little funky, whether it's on a college campus or at your town board meeting, go to thefire.org and submit a case. We'll get back to you within 24 hours.
That's great. At the bare minimum, follow FIRE on social media and retweet their tweets, right?
Yes, bare minimum, but we want more.
Yeah. It's a fire that will never be kindled. All right.
Too many puns.
Connor, thank you so much for talking with us. It's Libertarian Christian Podcast.
No, thank you for having me, Cody. Keep up the good work.